Um, so just a little context, a little background on what we're talking about with integrations. The idea is that there's lots of applications outside of XNet that are of interest to XNet users, and it would be awfully nice to leverage this complementary functionality, directly through XNet or through direct ties between the applications. This can be other viewers aside from the OHIP viewer. It can be external applications that just want to consume XNet data or are generating data that XNet wants to consume. Or it could be moving data around or integrating data sets of different modalities or clinical and non-imaging types of data with that imaging data. So there's a lot of different kinds of things that can be integrated. And we do have different ways of integrating. So obviously we have the container service where apps can be embedded into containers and deployed directly into XNet. Or we have the API, which can be accessed directly through the REST calls or through various SDKs, including the various Python libraries. We are just about ready to release DICOM Web, which is going to be a really useful way to integrate between XNet and DICOM modalities. And there's probably other ways that we could be thinking about integrating with apps. We've been doing this kind of thing for a long time. We have various viewers that we've integrated with over the years. So here's Osirix and what the XNet interface into Osirix looks like. Here's the FSLI's view for reviewing neuroimaging and neuroimaging derived data in FSLIs. This is 3D Slicer, obviously a very powerful workstation environment that we've had various flavors of integrations with XNet over the years. And I believe still works, but as I'll mention in our sort of challenges, these things can atrophy quickly, particularly for applications like 3D Slicer, which are very actively developed, and they're often kind of at the bleeding edge of how they're implementing things. Here's MITK. One of the things that we have established, as you'll see kind of as I flip through these, is there's sort of a common motif for how to structure what XNet hosted data look like within these applications. So you can kind of see project, subject, session, scan type of views in tree structures like this. And I think that tends to work pretty nicely. It'll be interesting to see if we can achieve the same sort of structures as we move more towards DICOM Web, which is fundamentally not a research data structure format. So we might lose some of what's been a nice way of organizing data. And of course, there's obviously the OHIP Viewer, which we've already talked a lot about. But even within the OHIP Viewer, there's the opportunity to have more integrations and ability to plug in capabilities. The first and only one we've done so far has been the NVIDIA AI-assisted annotation. But really, this should be a thing where you could plug in all kinds of things, whether it's other ways of doing automations, or different kinds of annotation tools, or different kinds of ways of reporting and annotating images. So there's a lot of opportunity for being able to plug things in. But to date, I don't think there's been a great architecture within OHIP for how to think about where plugins and additional capabilities would be added. On the data side, we've done various kinds of integrations over the years. I mentioned yesterday that we've been working on this TCIA integration, TCIA being the Cancer Image Archive, which is a NCI-funded public resource for sharing cancer-related imaging data. For a long time, they've had a process where you installed, I think, CTP locally, and then it was a kind of a specially flavored CTP or a clinical trial processor that you'd install locally, get your data into that, and then from there you could submit to a holding tank that they call POSDA, from which they would review the anonymization, and finally it would show up in the Cancer Image Archive. But if you're already in XNet, that's a really awkward workflow to have to get your data out of XNet into CTP and then separately uploaded into their archive. So we thought it'd be a lot more streamlined to just be able to basically have a push of a button, select your data set that you want to share to TCIA, to run a TCIA approved anonymization script within XNAT itself. So you've already established an anonymization complies with their requirements, and to use TCIA provided identifiers in that anonymization process, so that the data as you're sending it over is already kind of in a state that they can absorb directly into their repository. My guess is they'll continue to do some review and curation before it actually shows up in their public data sets. But one issue they've had within TCIA for years is that when the data gets to them, it's often not really well organized. So they have to spend a lot of time on curation. I think if the data is coming directly out of XNAT, that it'll already be much better organized in ways that will streamline their processes. Another area we've been working on data integration is to be able to use EPIC, which is the probably the most widely used medical record system, at least in the United States, to get clinical data out of EPIC and into XNAT, and to identify cohorts, and to be able to extract imaging data from the PACS based on cohorts defined in EPIC. So EPIC has a tool called Slicer Dicer, which allows you to search for patient data that meet certain filter criteria. So here they're searching on age and diagnosis. And then from this, we're working with EPIC to be able to just add a button that says, okay, export this cohort to XNAT, and then from XNAT, you'd have that list of patients, and then you'd be able to request through the connection to the PACS, the imaging exams of interest for those patients. This is a work in progress, but I think is a really important integration between what happens on the clinical side and what happens on the research side. We've never had a great way to build cohorts based on clinical criteria. And this is a start in that direction. Obviously, it has issues because it's EPIC dependent. It's requiring us to figure out how to work with EPIC, and they're not the most open organization in the world. But I think it will power a ton of cohort development and really streamline the process that's been very slow and tedious for many years. I talked yesterday a little bit about notebook integration, and maybe this goes to help ease some of Pradeep's concerns of being able to just have your people who are really good at writing Python be able to just work in sort of their native habitat. And notebooks are one of the common ways to do that, and in particular to be able to share Python scripts between groups, and to have some visualization kind of built in. So over the years, we've done a number of different notebooks interfaces into XNAT. These are several. I think Misha wrote most of these for doing various kind of quality control review and annotation of images. And this is, I think he uses these on a daily basis to streamline his workflows. And it's been a really nice way to develop capabilities quickly that kind of look and feel like you're working directly with XNAT data. The issue to date has been that you have to run your own notebook server, and the data obviously are sitting somewhere else, and you have to pull the data to your local notebook to work with it. So one of the areas we're starting to work on is how to run notebooks more directly from the XNAT server, which would look something like this, kind of a complicated figure, so I won't go into too much detail, but the idea is that the notebooks would be running in a server container hosted adjacent to XNAT itself, and you could launch a notebook from XNAT with the data already kind of mounted and accessible within the notebook. Kind of looking more at where we're heading with some kind of data integrations. One of the ones that's been on my mind is better interfacing out onto the cloud. So if you have a data set that is ready for publishing, that you could run anonymization from your local XNAT, export it into AWS Data Exchange, which is one of the AWS services for hosting data sets. And then from Data Exchange, that you could run an XNAT instance on the cloud that would just kind of index that data within Data Exchange and be able to publish it from a cloud-hosted XNAT instance. I also mentioned this yesterday. I have an ambition to be able to generalize interfaces into how we talk to external applications. And webhooks is one of the interesting ways to do that. Many cloud-hosted kind of SaaS services provide these hooks into moving data in and out of them. Typeform is one of those, for example, which is a very fast way. If you have a form that you want data entry, you can just create a form there, all GUI based, drag and drop, and you can create quite complicated forms that way. And then ideally, as soon as one of those forms is submitted by, say, a subject who's maybe doing a behavioral evaluation or a cognitive assessment, that as soon as that's submitted on Typeform, that it could be automatically just sent over to XNAT. And there's all kinds of very cool things there, but there's also, of course, challenges, right? Like that, well, if you're entering data within Typeform, is Typeform itself HIPAA compliant? Is there secure exchange of data coming from Typeform into XNAT? And those are things that'll need to be worked out and thought through, but I think they'll end up being manageable. Airtable is another application I use a lot for doing quick data entry and structuring of data. It's sort of like a hybrid between a database and Excel. And I found that to be a really useful way to get data quickly into a format that could be ingested into XNAT. And similarly, Airtable has hooks that would allow submitting into XNAT. But all these things raise some issues. One of the things that has already come up, and how do we deal with progress, meaning things like OHIP are constantly developing on their own, and they often change out from underneath you. How do we deal with those changing interfaces and changing structures from the applications that we work with? I've found that it sort of introduces this sort of level of atrophy that we'll work hard with the group like 3D Slicer, get it working nicely together, and then Slicer moves on, does their own thing, and I can never guarantee does XNAT and Slicer still work together. Right now, I can't tell you because we haven't tested it in a while. And so that kind of leads to some just kind of mismatches in expectations and management of integrations. What are the main standards that we want to think about supporting? Obviously, DICOM Web has a lot of power to it, in that any application that supports DICOM Web, and if XNAT supports DICOM Web, we can just talk to one another without further development. So some real opportunity there. Are there other standards for exchanging data that we should be looking at? Security and access control, I think, are probably the biggest issues as we expand the breadth of kinds of applications we're integrating with. How do we continue to maintain the privacy and sensitivity around the data, and managing access control of who can see what? And then, of course, I'm really interested to hear from folks on what are the applications and key domains and areas of types of applications that we should be prioritizing as we're thinking about these things. So with that, I will kind of take a look at what Q&A we have coming in.
And Dan, those people are allowed to unmute themselves. So if you want to invite discussion, that should work.
Okay, Marc, you want to ask your question?
Yeah. So when you mentioned pulling the data from EPICS, the non-imaging data, this is brilliant. We just need EPICS here, but we've got other means of pulling data from EHR. But I was wondering how you organize, how you structure the data within XNAT, because that's been one of the challenge. Because on one side we can just have a massive JSON where we just put everything. But then we are lacking the structure from the XNAT standpoint. Or on the other side, we've got the extreme, we need to recreate all of the forms. So I was wondering what approach you took there.
Yeah, well, so on the first pass, we're really using this just to identify the patient cohorts, based on the clinical filtering, and then pulling the relevant exams. And
So
we're
it's
not actually
basically,
storing the
so
clinical.
you're using that as inclusion exclusion criteria and then focusing on the imaging only.
Yeah, effectively.
But do you envisage that you will also pull this information? I mean, what we are doing is that we are looking at all of the report. It goes through NLP so that we extract some sort of ontology, and so that we can use that as covariate or input features for our modeling later down the line. So we'd like to have it in XNAT as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So that would be phase 2 of kind of where we're heading with it. And I think this is a wide open area as far as how we think about storing clinical data, which is going to be, largely unstructured, or even when it's structured, there's not necessarily an XNAT data type that knows how to store it.
Yeah. So,
and this goes back to, I think, a comment that was coming in from the previous sessions of like, okay, if you have kind of random assessments, and XNAT, historically has wanted you to build a data type for those things, that those are kind of a mismatch. So how do we get XNAT to better handle kind of arbitrary data? And I think that's probably the number one thing hanging over XNAT that we'll need to address.
So the approach we took is that we've got, as part of the AI centers that we mentioned yesterday, we've got XNAT handling the imaging side, and then we use an OHIP model to store the rest. And because we didn't manage to pull everything together. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize it was me. Sorry, someone calling. But we didn't manage to get everything into XNAT. So.
Yeah, so that's an area I'm really interested in as well, Marc, and we should find an opportunity to work with it. I'd also like to hear a lot about how you're thinking about the NLP to build data dictionaries and better structure the data, because that's another area that's a bit untamed.
That would be a great breakout meeting, even after the workshop. Maybe have a follow-on meeting about this, because I think there's several of us who've been thinking a lot about it, but we need to just coalesce on a solution.
Yeah, we use something called CogStack to pull all of the data from the EHR and all of the different databases. But yeah, we can take that offline.
Hey,
Great.
Dan.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I just had a question, and it was more on: is there a way to strip the metadata on the outbound? So with our HPC environment, so we have 2 local, one we're building out that's gonna be HIPAA compliant, but the main university HPC is non-HIPAA compliant. So is there a way to strip the data as it's getting transferred to the compute resource? So this way, our XNAT session can have all the relevant data we need, but we're not having to then have a separate space to do the metadata cleaning before we then ship it again to the HPC environment. I just wasn't sure if that was something that is on the roadmap, or something that someone else has already figured out a good workflow for that.
Yeah, it's a good question. And are you referring specifically to the DICOM metadata?
Yeah, exactly. Because right now, although where our first instance of this new deployment is just research scans, the goal is eventually, like a lot of the people here, using this in the clinical setting. And if we want to still be able to use our local HPC environment, then that becomes even more stringent.
I think at one point we had a sort of dynamic anonymizer that, as images were being exported from XNAT, that could apply an outbound anonymization script. Tim?
Yeah, we've had kind of beta implementations of that. I don't know that it's made it into production release of XNAT. We have done systems where, as you access the data, it goes through an additional stage, or as you download the data, it goes through an additional stage of anonymization. This is to support some of this data duplication, where you want to have one copy of the data that is lightly anonymized and another copy of the data that is heavily anonymized, but you don't want to duplicate the files. So we've done that. It hasn't made it into production, and it would be great to see that emphasized. I think it fits in well with kind of the export and copying feature set of XNAT, an export service. That would be a useful sub feature of that.
So there's a couple of questions related to Redcap. Chris, if you're unmuted, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on what the best way to think about Redcap integration and XNAT would look like.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. So I'm primarily the Redcap admin at a hospital in Toronto. We were using XNAT to do an ultrasound study on rheumatoid arthritis. And the initial workflow was the person would create the record in Redcap with the hopes that the data would flow into XNAT so that we could then have the record ready to go in XNAT. That became too cumbersome. So what I did was I created a hyperlink field in Redcap with the record ID that the person could click on, and it would take them to the subject in XNAT. That worked okay, but it was very cumbersome. Some people were noticing some performance issues on clicking the links. So I'm trying to find other options. I'm seeing some comments here from Dan Beasley and a couple of others that there's some work being done, but just wondered if there was anything formally proposed to work on this.
Yeah, I will say Redcap is probably the number one thing I hear about when I'm meeting with users and sites. And we have worked over the years to get better Redcap integration, but we've not had really good success with it. You know, some things like, I think the cumbersome things you mentioned, like of trying to click from Redcap into XNAT, and then you got to like re-log in as a different user, and you may have different access levels between Redcap and XNAT, and there's no real single sign-on. Those have made the experience feel really clunky, and for me have been sort of deal breakers in like how much energy we can put towards the integration. But it could also be that we just haven't solved, you know, really kind of crack the code on it of how to get single sign-on working and how to think about access controls.
Right.
So I don't know if Dan or anyone wants to comment on how they've approached that, Dan Beasley or anyone else who's kind of been working on the Redcap integrations.
I can comment for Dan if you want, if he's not muted. So basically what we've created is not really integration between the two, is that you can create a Redcap dictionary like the CSV file, and then you upload that into a script that generates an XNAT form, so that you just put that as a data type, so that you can store your information there. So it's to speed up the process without having to go within the template and things like that.
Yeah, so, and there's this like spreadsheet form, so clinicians can fill it in, and then it's converted into an XNAT plugin to make things a lot easier for people to update and change plugins. And it can convert Redcap dictionaries, which is a helpful tool, I suppose.
Dan, I posted my email address in the chat there if you want to connect. I'd love to hear more about what you're working on.
And I suspect there may be enough interest around Redcap integrations that, you know, a working group might make sense to get some of us together who've been thinking about it.
I would love that.
Yes.
And I'll note this is almost a step towards like a federation.
Are you suggesting it's time to cut over to your next session?
Maybe.
Well, let's, fair enough. I've let everybody run long, so I should be punished by having to cut my session a little bit short. But definitely, folks, continue to reach out to me if you have thoughts on important integrations that we should be including with XNAT. I saw several other questions coming in about some suggestions. For example, OpenHIM seems interesting. I'm not familiar with it, so need to learn more. So I'll hand over to Tim to talk about data federations.